In this video I share some great tips for sports photography. I test out the Nikon Z6 and see how the images compare against the Nikon D3500. Plus, stick around to the end of the video for tips on Lightroom and editing your images.
Hi, Paul here from Photogenius. We are at the Gabba, which is the home of the Brisbane Lions. Today it's all about sports photography. I'm going to be putting these two cameras up against each other. A bit of a David and Goliath setup here. We've got the Nikon D3500, we've got the Nikon Z6 mirrorless camera. Stick around for some great tips. We're going to have a fun morning. So let's start with the Nikon D3500. Now, I got this camera as soon as it came out, and whilst it might be an entry-level camera, I've been really impressed with the quality out of this camera. It really does perform really well. Today I'm using a 70 to 300mm telephoto lens, and because this camera uses a cropped sensor, that is equivalent to 105 to 400mm. So that should get me nice and close to the action. And just as well, because at the moment this training session is going on at the far end of the pitch. Now, the camera mode I've been using is shutter priority. Now, this is a great mode for sports photography because you can lock in a fast shutter speed and the camera looks after the aperture for you. If the camera struggles, you will know because the F number, the aperture value, will start to flash. And occasionally here the sun's gone behind a cloud or the action's gone into shady areas. So I've had to increase the ISO on occasion. I've been using around about 400 to 1600 ISO, but so far the results from this camera are pretty good. So I'm really happy with the results I'm getting with the D3500 so far. I'm now switching to the Z6, which is Nikon's latest mirrorless camera. This camera's a lot heavier. It's got a 70 to 200 lens on the front as well, which is pretty heavy. So you'll see I'm using a monopod. Look, if you like doing sports photography or taking photos of maybe wildlife, animals, it's all about stability. A monopod is a really good investment. Let's see how the Z6 performs. So the Z6 and the Z7 were released by Nikon some months ago. I didn't need the 45 megapixels of the Z7, so I went for the cheaper Z6. And to be honest, this camera's been making lots of waves. People are raving about it, not just for its still image quality, but also its video quality. I've only had this a few days, so really today is my first opportunity to take some photos and have some fun with it. And to be honest, so far, it's amazing. Now, in terms of camera settings, I've set this up pretty much the same as the D3500. I'm using the AFC autofocus continuous mode. That keeps up with the moving subjects and the action. I'm using dynamic focus area. I'm doing continuous shooting. Here's where there's a big difference. The D3500, I think it's shooting at around about 3 to 4 frames a second. This camera is capable of 12 frames per second. It's incredibly fast. Now let's talk about the lens that I've got on the front of the camera. This is my favorite telephoto lens. I've had this quite a long time now. This is the 70 to 200mm f2.8 lens. It's just absolutely fantastic. It's pin sharp. But what's really useful is that wide aperture. On the D3500, I've got a longer lens, a 70 to 300mm lens, which is going to get me much closer to the action. This one, because it's on a full frame camera, won't get me as close to the action, but that wide aperture is really useful, particularly as it's gone a bit overcast now and we've lost some light. With this camera, I'm not having to push the ISO as much as I am with the D3500, so therefore I'm expecting the images to be a bit crisper and sharper. So a great morning of sports photography here at the Gabba, home of the Brisbane Lions. These guys are about to wrap up their training session, so I think it's time to head back to the office now, take a look at the images. So back in the office after a great morning of taking photos, and I want to say a big thank you to the Brisbane Lions for looking after me this morning and giving me great access. I had about an hour of shooting during the training session, and in that time I managed to take 159 images with the Z6 and 185 images with the D3500. And in a moment we're going to take a look at those images and see how the cameras compared. But before we do, I want to go over the camera settings once again so you can try this for yourself. And don't worry if you're not using a Nikon camera, because these settings should work with any current DSLR or mirrorless camera. Now this video is designed to show you how to take better photos with your cameras, and generally I focus more on the beginner or entry level type cameras, and in this video I'm putting a entry level Nikon D3500 against a Nikon Z6. I can buy 6 of these for one of these. This is a great camera. Is this a fair comparison? Well, you know what, maybe not, but it's fun. And what I really want to show you is that you don't have to spend a fortune on gear to take great photos. You just need to know how to use the camera and how to set it up correctly. So let's take a look at those settings. So let's start by taking a look at the camera mode that I was shooting in. Now I was using shutter priority mode. This is my go-to mode when I'm shooting sports or moving subjects. So this can also be very useful for things like wildlife. Now shutter priority is great because you only need to worry about the shutter speed. You can lock that in, and the camera helps by looking after the aperture, and this means that we can then put our efforts into concentrating on the game and the action and trying to capture the moment. If you've got a Nikon, this is S on your camera dial, and if you've got a Canon camera, this is TV, which stands for time value. It's the same thing, just a different name, and this is a great mode and I definitely recommend trying it out. Now in the video I mentioned occasionally I was increasing the ISO. ISO is another great way of controlling light, and it affects the brightness of your image. Now sometimes this morning the action went from being in the sunlight to being in the shade and the light levels dipped. Also for a while it got a bit overcast. We even had a spell of rain, and during those times again the light levels dipped. So to keep the shutter speed higher I increased the ISO. So when you're using shutter priority, be prepared to increase the ISO occasionally, particularly on dull or overcast days, and this is where sometimes auto ISO can be quite useful. Now if you're a bit confused about shutter speed and you want to know more about shutter priority, I've done a separate video all about it. I'll put a link up here, but as usual you'll find all the links also in the description below this video. Now with the shutter priority mode helping us to get a great exposure, of course the next step is to make sure we get our subject in focus, which can be tricky when your subject is constantly moving. So when I'm photographing sports events or maybe wildlife or anything that's moving, I use the servo focus mode. If you've got a Nikon camera, this is called AFC, which is autofocus continuous, and if you've got a Canon camera, this is called AI servo. And this is great because the camera doesn't just focus and then lock the focus. It keeps focusing and it keeps adjusting the focus as the subject moves away or closer to the camera. All you've got to do is turn this mode on, point your camera at the subject, press and hold the shutter button halfway down, that's really important, and your camera will adjust the focus as and when your subject moves. It's a great mode. Now let's talk about autofocus area mode. Now this is great because you can tell your camera what you want to focus on. Generally with most cameras, particularly if they're in the auto mode, when you press and hold the shutter button down, the camera focuses on what it thinks the subject is. Now with sports, it's very important to be able to tell the camera where you want to focus, where your subject is. So using this mode, what you can do is select the middle focus point, which is the one I would recommend. All you've got to do then again is track the subject, keeping the middle focus point on the subject at all times, and your camera should nail the focus every time. This is a great mode. I did a really cool video all about it. Put a link up here and also in the description below the video. And finally, another mode I always use when I'm shooting sports is the continuous shooting mode. This means I can press and hold the shutter button down, and as long as I'm holding the button down, the camera keeps taking photos. This means that I'm more likely to capture that moment. Now this on some cameras is called drive mode, on some cameras it's continuous or release mode. Okay, so that's the camera mode sorted. I really hope some of you guys will test this out for yourselves. Now it's time to fire up Lightroom because I'm really keen to see how these images turned out and how the cameras compared. Okay, so I've imported the images into Lightroom, so all the pictures from the D3500 and the Z6 are now into Lightroom. We'll take a look at the images in a moment and stick around to the end of the video for a gallery of the best of the bunch. Now, a couple of tips here if you're a Lightroom user, or maybe you're a budding Lightroom user. Keywording. Keywording allows you to apply keywords to images, meaning you can then search for those keywords and pull images up really easily. This is easily done by typing in the keywords over to the right hand side of the screen here. And here we have the images that were shot on the D3500. Keywords I've used: Brisbane Lions, D3500 and sport. And this is great because in a year's time, if I want to find out where those Brisbane Lions shots are that I shot on the D3500, I can just type those keywords in and up they come. Big time saver. Number 2, another great tip, rate your images. Now, I shot 185 images with the D3500. Of course, not all the images are going to be great. So what I do is I look through these images and I give my favorites a 4-star rating simply by pressing 4 on the keyboard. Then what I do is I have a break, I go back and I filter, and I do this by applying a filter, clicking on 4 stars, and now I see all the images that have a 4-star rating. I go through these and give the best of these a 5-star rating. Now, I shot 185 images initially. I'm now down to my absolute favorite 41 images. This again is a big time saver. And it has to be said that considering the D3500 is an entry-level camera, the images that I got out of the camera look really good. They're nice and sharp, so the focusing system is doing its job. The exposures are generally pretty good. Yeah, they've had a little bit of a tweak here and there, but generally the images look pretty awesome. Now, these images have been edited already, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how I went through the editing process. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a quick edit. I've chosen one image. This was taken with the Nikon D3500, and if I bring this image up, you'll see that this image is the same as the one on the back monitor over here. It's one of my favorites. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Develop module in Lightroom, and I'm going to show you how the image looked straight out of camera. Now, typically raw images look very flat straight out of the camera. Here is the original image. If we zoom in, not only does it look flat, but you'll see that there is a lot of digital noise. But using Lightroom, we can reduce this. Now, this digital noise is simply because I had to increase the ISO while I was taking the photos, and this sort of level of digital noise is not ideal, but it is to be expected on entry-level cameras. But again, it's you know, something that I can definitely try and deal with in Lightroom. So if I now go to the edit, you'll see how it looks. The digital noise has pretty much gone and the image looks much more vibrant. It looks really cool. This image has already been cropped as well. If I turn the crop tool off temporarily, you'll see how the original image looked, but I think the crop looks really good and works really well. The tight crop around the group, lots of action going on. I think it's a pretty good shot. So this image did look flat straight out of camera, so I've increased the contrast, brought down the highlights where there was a couple of overexposed areas, added a bit of texture and clarity for sharpness. The image has been sharpened slightly, and because this has a tendency to make the digital noise look even worse, I've applied some noise reduction as well. So to be honest, a couple of minutes of editing and I think this image looks pretty good. And this goes to prove that if you know your way around the camera and you know a bit about editing, you can get great pictures even with basic entry-level cameras. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the images out of the Nikon Z6. If I go back to my keywords and I change D3500 to Z6, now I get a bunch of images taken with the Nikon Z6. So again, this is using the keyword tool. Here are my favorite images. So I'm filtering 5 stars. So I'm seeing the best of the bunch. Now look, it has to be said, and probably to be expected, the Z6 outperformed the D3500 by a mile. The images were sharp, they were crisp, the color was amazing, and digital noise was almost non-existent. These images looked amazing straight out of the camera. So let's pick one of my favorite images, which is this one here. Let's go into the Develop module in Lightroom, and if I hit the / button, you can see and compare the original version with the edited version. So this is the unedited version This is the edited version, and there really isn't much different. The original image did lack a bit of contrast and was slightly overexposed, so I brought down the highlights, increased the contrast a little bit, and applied just the tiniest amount of sharpening. If I go to the crop tool, you can see that I've cropped in quite severely here, but because the Z6 is a full frame camera, I can crop in really quite tight and still get a nice looking image. Now zooming in on the image, you can see there is no noticeable digital noise at all. If we go back to the original image and then the edit, it looks absolutely stunning. So the results to be expected were pretty amazing with the Z6. Now I want to show you one image in particular. This one I posted to the Photogenius Instagram a few days ago. This again has been cropped. I'm going to show you the original image. So here you can see how I applied the crop. If I hit the backslash, this is the original image and this is the edit. Now after cropping, there was a random foot over here in the bottom right hand corner of the image. Now Lightroom isn't so good at editing out things like this, so I took this into Photoshop, got rid of the foot, and there's the finished edit. Again, it looks absolutely amazing. So let's now take a look at a selection of images taken with both the Z6 and the D3500, but let's see if you can spot which camera the images were taken with. So how many did you get right? Maybe you can leave a comment down below. I hope this has shown you that you can take great photos of any camera as long as you know how to set it up and how to get the most from it. And that's what this channel is all about. So if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I also hope this given you an insight into the power of Lightroom, because Lightroom is amazing. This was never going to be a technical video. This was never going to be all about the Z6 or the D3500. It was just a bit of fun. The Z6 is a new camera. I'm going to feature it on some more videos in the future, of course, but it was just a chance to really test it out, and I hope you've picked up some great tips along the way. If you've enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up, consider subscribing to my channel, and of course you can leave comments, suggestions and questions down below. I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya, bye.